The invisible restlessness. You start a book and stop on page 7. Not because the story is bad, not because the author is weak, but because something in you begins to stir. A subtle impatience, an urgency with no clear reason, as if staying there required too much effort. You tell yourself you're tired, that the day was long, that you'll continue tomorrow. But tomorrow, it's the same. You try watching a slower film, a story that breathes, that unfolds gradually, and you feel discomfort. Nothing happens fast enough, nothing explodes, nothing screams. And without noticing, you reach for your phone, not out of necessity, out of reflex. You speed up the audio, speed up the video, speed up even your own thoughts. 1.5x, 2x, as if depth could be compressed, as if understanding were a matter of speed. But it isn't. You read headlines, not articles. You save content, but never return to it. You consume ideas like tasting appetizers, never like sitting down for a full meal. And there's something even more subtle. You no longer finish sentences in your own mind. A notification interrupts, one thought pulls another, a stimulus intrudes. Your mind doesn't conclude, it jumps from topic to topic, from screen to screen, from tab to tab, always moving, rarely going deep. And the strange part is, you're still productive, still responding, still active, but something feels off. A growing difficulty in sustaining attention on anything that doesn't vibrate, flash, or call for you. You realize you can no longer stand in silence in an elevator, wait in line without touching your screen, eat alone without digital company. There's always a part of you searching for stimulation, even when there is none, especially when there is none. And perhaps the quietest shift of all is this: you can no longer simply be. Be in a conversation without dividing attention. Be with a thought without escaping it. Be in a moment without recording, comparing, or posting it. Being has become effort, and staying has become almost painful. Your mind used to be steadier. It could dive. It could move through pages, long ideas, difficult conversations. Today, it skims the surface. It glides, but it doesn't sink. And maybe you haven't named this yet. Maybe you call it lack of time. Maybe you call it exhaustion. Maybe you blame your routine. But there's a more uncomfortable possibility. You didn't lose time. You lost depth. And when depth is lost, it's not just reading that changes. It's how you think, how you decide, how you become. And this is where the problem stops being distraction and starts becoming identity. The rewired brain. Your brain was not designed for this pace. It was designed for cycles, focus, pause, observation, reflection. But the environment changed, and the brain does what it has always done. It adapts. Every time you rapidly switch between tasks, a part of your prefrontal cortex activates. It decides, it shifts, it recalculates. And every shift consumes energy. Small, but real. Now imagine doing that dozens, hundreds of times a day. It doesn't feel like physical fatigue, but it is cognitive exhaustion. You end the day feeling like you did a lot, and yet, strangely, you can't deeply remember almost anything, because depth requires continuity, and continuity has been replaced by switching. There is another subtle layer. The brain learns through reinforcement. What produces a micro-reward gets registered as desirable behavior. Notification equals reward. Scroll equals novelty. Refresh equals anticipation. And dopamine enters as the messenger, not of pleasure, but of promise. It doesn't say, "This is wonderful." It says, "Maybe the next one will be." And it is that constant promise that keeps you scrolling, not the content, the expectation. And continuous expectation creates restlessness. Your nervous system begins to operate in a low-level state of alert. Nothing dramatic, just a constant internal hum, a faint background anxiety, enough to make silence uncomfortable. Because in silence, there is no promise of novelty, no anticipation, no micro-reward. There is only you. And for a brain trained on rapid stimulation, that feels like emptiness. But it isn't emptiness, it's the absence of immediate dopamine. And the absence of immediate dopamine feels like loss. So you seek, automatically, without conscious decision, without reflection. That's why you reach for your phone before you even realize you've decided to. That's why you open a new tab while the other one is still loading. That's why it becomes difficult to sustain a thought to its conclusion. Your brain has learned to prioritize variety over depth, and constant variety creates fragmentation. Fragmentation creates superficiality, and prolonged superficiality changes the way you think. Not because you became less intelligent, but because your intelligence was trained to operate in fast mode. The problem? Fast mode is excellent for reacting, but terrible for understanding. And understanding requires something that is becoming rare, sustained attention, without interruption, without switching, without the promise of reward. Pause. What you call lack of focus may simply be a brain that learned to survive in a hyper-stimulated environment. But surviving is not the same as flourishing.
The architecture of capture. There is something you need to understand calmly. You did not simply fall into distraction. You were invited and then retained. The modern economy discovered something simple. Attention is the most valuable resource of this century. Not oil, not gold, not data by itself. Attention. Because whoever controls attention influences perception. And whoever influences perception influences decision. And decision moves markets. So the competition shifted. It is no longer about quality. It is about retention. How long you stay, how often you return, how many times you touch the screen. There is a silent metric called time on platform. It is worth more than applause, more than praise, more than depth. If you stay, the system wins, and everything is designed for that. Infinite scroll is not an accident. It removes the natural ending. Books end, films end, conversations end. The feed does not. Without an ending, there is no psychological closure. Without closure, there is no conscious decision to stop. There is only automatic continuation. And when something begins automatically, you don't have to choose. And when you don't choose, you simply continue.
There is another almost invisible detail. Notifications are red. Red activates alert, urgency, priority, even when nothing is urgent. Each small red circle is an invitation to interruption, not from the outside world, from your own line of thought. And the more you interrupt your own thinking, the less confidence you develop in it. You begin to trust the external flow more than your internal reflection. Now look deeper. Algorithms learn your emotional patterns. They detect what outrages you, what excites you, what holds your gaze the longest, and they adjust content to maximize that response. Not to balance you, not to mature you, but to keep you responsive. And a constantly responsive mind is not necessarily a conscious one. It reacts quickly, shares quickly, judges quickly, but rarely contemplates. There is also a silent incentive for shorter content, because shorter content allows more reward cycles, more clicks per minute, more stimulus per second. This trains the brain to expect immediate resolution.
But life does not operate in 30-second clips. Real decisions are slow. Real relationships are slow. Real transformation is slow. And when your brain becomes accustomed to constant speed, the real world begins to feel insufficient, less interesting, less stimulating. You start calling long books boring, deep conversations exhausting, silence unnecessary. But perhaps the problem is not the book, not the conversation, not the silence. Perhaps it lies in the calibration of your nervous system. And here comes the uncomfortable point. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the business model. Fragmentation keeps you returning. Because when attention is broken into smaller pieces, it becomes easier to capture again. A deeply focused mind is difficult to interrupt. A fragmented mind is always interruptible. And what is easily interrupted is easily directed. Do you see the gravity of this? We are not talking about lost time. We are talking about autonomy. When you do not control what sustains your attention, you do not fully control what shapes your mind. And what shapes your mind shapes your identity.
The loss of inner autonomy. There is a brutal difference between using something and being used by something, and that line is almost invisible. You believe you choose what you consume, but observe honestly. How many times have you opened an app with a clear intention and left 40 minutes later without remembering what you actually saw? You entered by decision, but you remained by guidance. It's subtle, and what is subtle is dangerous because you don't feel like you lost control. You feel like you just got distracted. But autonomy is never lost all at once. It weakens through micro-delegations. You delegate the next video, then the next topic, then the next thought that will occupy your mind before sleep. And little by little, your internal line of thinking begins to fragment. Before, you could sit and develop an idea to its end. Now it is interrupted by external reminders. Before, you chose when to stop. Now something ends automatically, and something else begins without your decision. It seems like a technical detail. It is not, because repeated decision builds identity, and the absence of decision does too.
When you do not consciously choose where your attention lands, you begin to live in reactive flow, and constant reaction reduces depth of judgment. You feel before you reflect. You react before you analyze. You comment before you understand. And something essential shifts: your sense of authorship. Inner autonomy is mental authorship. It is the ability to say, I choose to sustain this. I choose to stop now. I choose not to feed this thought. But when the environment chooses for you hundreds of times a day, that muscle weakens. There is also a psychological effect rarely discussed: the illusion of choice. You can choose among thousands of pieces of content, but you rarely choose the rhythm, rarely choose the order, rarely choose the intensity. You choose within a structure already designed for you. It is conditioned freedom. And conditioned freedom, if not perceived, turns into accommodation.
Now let's go deeper. Attention shapes memory. Memory shapes internal narrative. Internal narrative shapes identity. If your recent memory is composed mostly of fragmented stimuli, your internal narrative becomes fragmented. You begin to think in pieces, feel in pieces, live in pieces. And when your inner experience is fragmented, your sense of unity diminishes. You feel scattered. Not just busy, scattered. And a scattered person struggles to make deep decisions, because deep decision requires internal clarity. Clarity requires silence. Silence requires autonomy over attention. Do you see the cycle? Without attentional autonomy, there is no mental clarity. Without mental clarity, there is no existential direction. And then something subtle happens. You consume ready-made opinions because formulating your own requires energy. You adopt quick indignations because investigation requires time. You share strong statements because reflection requires silence. This is not about politics, not about culture. It is about internal sovereignty. If you do not choose what remains in your mind, you live under constant influence. And constant influence creates a malleable identity. Not flexible in the sense of adaptable, but moldable. Perhaps the greatest loss of our era is not focus, not time, but the ability to govern one's own consciousness. And without inner governance, any external stimulus can take the throne.
Attention as an act of resistance. If your attention was trained, it can be retrained. But this does not begin with an app. It does not begin with a technique. It begins with a quiet decision. Because inner autonomy is not about reclaiming time. It is about reclaiming command. There is something deeply radical today that seems too simple to notice. To stay. To stay with a book when restlessness appears. To stay in a conversation without dividing your mind. To stay in silence without rushing to anesthetize the space. At first, it feels like loss because you are conditioned for acceleration. But staying is not slowness, it is depth, and depth is accumulated strength. Every time you interrupt an automatic impulse, something shifts. Every time you choose not to click, something strengthens. Every time you sustain attention, even when your brain asks for novelty, you rebuild sovereignty.
Reconstruction is not dramatic. It is almost invisible. It happens when you finish an entire chapter without switching tabs. You listen to someone fully without checking your phone. You allow silence to exist without filling it. These acts seem small, but they are internal declarations. They say, "I choose." And repeated choice builds structure. Structure builds stability. Stability builds clarity. And clarity restores direction. Do you see the contrast? The system wants instant response. You choose slow reflection. The system wants infinite retention. You choose conscious closure. The system wants constant stimulation. You choose deliberate presence. This is not loud rebellion. It is silent resistance. And silent resistance is more powerful because it does not depend on applause. It depends on consistency.
There comes a point when something shifts inside you. Restlessness begins to lose its grip. The impulse to switch weakens. Silence stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like space. Space to organize thought, space to perceive nuance, space to decide with less noise. And when the noise decreases, your perception changes. You begin to notice what once passed unnoticed: contradictions, emotional manipulation, superficiality. And this does not create arrogance, it creates discernment. Discernment is the consequence of sustained attention. Without sustained attention, there is no deep thinking. Without deep thinking, there is no real autonomy. And without real autonomy, there is no solid identity. Perhaps that is why protecting your attention is the most important act of your generation. Not because the world will stop, but because you can choose not to be dragged. You do not control the algorithm, but you control where your eyes rest. You do not control the flow of stimuli, but you control how long you allow them to stay. You do not control the external world, but you can reclaim internal governance. And internal governance is the beginning of any true transformation. To recover your attention is to recover your mind. To recover your mind is to recover your direction. To recover your direction is to recover your life. Not with noise, not with announcements, but with permanence, silent, consistent, deliberate. The quiet turning point. There's a quiet moment when everything said here stops being theory and becomes a mirror. It is not when you agree, it is when you recognize yourself. Perhaps you have already noticed that part of your restlessness is not the world's fault. It is habit. Perhaps you have already noticed that part of your exhaustion is not overwork, it is fragmentation. Perhaps you have already realized that the problem is not lack of time, it is lack of depth. But recognizing is not the same as deciding. There is an almost invisible point between understanding and change. That point is choice. Not a dramatic choice, not a public declaration, an intimate one. You can leave this video and open another immediately. Nothing prevents you. You can return to the automatic flow. Nothing will collapse. But you can also do something different. Not grand, just different. You can sit in silence for a few minutes. You can finish one thought before starting another. You can allow restlessness to appear without trying to correct it. It is in that small space that autonomy returns, not as explosive force, but as steady presence. Because autonomy is not imposed, it is practiced. And every practice begins with discomfort. Silence feels strange. Slowness feels unproductive. Staying feels like loss. Until something shifts. You begin to feel clarity. You begin to perceive coherence. You begin to recover direction. And direction is what was missing. Not more stimulation, not more information. Direction. Perhaps you do not need more content. Perhaps you need more space. Perhaps you do not need to accelerate. Perhaps you need to sustain. Because in the end, the issue was never technology, never time, never productivity. It was depth. And depth is not found by rushing. It is found by staying.